is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his home be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
I recall a long ago, middle of the night fire alarm in a hotel that sent hundreds of sleepy people scurrying to the parking lot in Atlanta. Or was it Houston? Dressed in my nightgown and a trench coat, I waited and watched, soon becoming fascinated by what the other hotel guests carried with them. One man clutched a briefcase to his chest as if it contained the Queen's jewels. A young woman had an overflowing tote bag from which I could see a hairdryer, what looked like hot rollers, probably a large bag of cosmetics. As for me, I brought only my purse and my room key. As the time wore on, I began to do a mental inventory of my possessions and what I would most miss, what would break my heart if my house should burn down. I honestly could not come up with much. Oh, some photographs, a very few family heirlooms. Everything else could be replaced. And in fact, it would probably be a good thing to lose a lot of what I had accumulated. On the other hand, I confess to putting too much stock in certain things. My beat-up little roadster, for example. I should just have it towed away as a donation to public radio. But I just can't seem to give it up. It represents so much, this middle life car, where I no longer needed the room to haul hockey bags and sticks or a load of overactive boys. The freedom of putting the top down, turning the radio up, usually playing opera, and zipping up and down the hills and through the countryside. Never mind the winter months. Where your treasure is, there is your heart also. It's always hard, at least for me, to address this 12th chapter of Luke, where the focus is on what matters most. It started last week with the parable of the landowner whose harvest had been so successful that he decided he needed to tear down all of his barns and build bigger ones. That doesn't seem so bad, does it? This would keep the crops safe from the elements and sustain him for some time to come. He could back off, enjoy life, and maybe even retire from years of farming. Is there something really wrong with this? It doesn't seem so different, really, from what we're told all of our lives, does it? What has been pounded into our brains, growth and success are good. Save, save, save for your old age or a rainy day. Don't be a burden on your children. Be a prudent money manager to stretch those assets. Make plans for the distribution of what's left with wills, living trusts, bequests. Yet, Jesus called him a fool. lifted him up as an example of greed and accumulation, even has him die suddenly without the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Well, maybe he was an absentee landlord, benefiting from the work of his laborers. Maybe he was stingy, keeping everything for himself. The text is not clear. It just gives us Jesus' comment. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Today, the text skips over that familiar bit about not worrying about you will eat or wear, the ravens and the lilies of the field teaching. And then it picks up right where Jesus tells his disciples to sell all of their possessions and give alms. But one of the skipped verses might just help us to link what comes next, where the text says to quit striving for all of those things that the world strives for and strive for God's kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Then Jesus said in today's reading, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." God's good pleasure, God's delight. I can't help but think of the thrill a parent or a grandparent feels when a special gift is received with wonder and joy. It was my grandparents' practice to give each grandchild their first bike at Christmas. As the present unwrapping began to wind down, a shiny new bicycle with a bow on the handlebars would be wheeled down the long hall and presented to the 5 or 6-year-old. My parents continued that practice. The year it was my son Dan's turn, he was truly stunned. He could barely speak. He looked at the bike in wonder, and he finally said, "For me? Oh, I didn't expect that." Of course, that doesn't always work. Like the year I was given many hints of a big special gift coming my way in my imagination, and it was going to be a piano, what I longed for. But a piano clearly wasn't going to fit into the box I received and unwrapped and discovered a huge, ornate, and formal silver tea set. The text focuses on God's pleasure in giving. It doesn't mention how the gift is received. And I wonder if, like those of us whose pleasure is greater when the child is delighted, God too waits with held breath for our response and feels disappointed seeing our faces when we unwrap the unwanted tea set. The gift God offers, the gift of the kingdom, is the greatest gift of all. It came with Jesus, and it awaits our accepting it to be complete. But time and time again, we've set it aside, let it gather dust in some upper cabinet. It was not what we expected. We thought it would be all done, a shiny new world of peace and justice and mercy for everyone. We didn't know it was going to take so much effort from us. So much. Yes, sacrifice, reordering of priorities, love. For it is God's pleasure to give us the kingdom. But Jesus also tells us that we must strive for the kingdom. It seems instead we've turned it into some pie in the sky when you die, far off reward in the next life, instead of our task as followers of Jesus right here, right now. There's the rub. How do we live for the kingdom in the world we have today? How do we then provide for our retirement years, our medical bills and such, and be prudent stewards of God's gifts and also follow Christ? I'm afraid this text brings up more questions, things we might all ponder. What really matters to us? What do our possessions mean? It's not just what our possessions do for us. What do our possessions do to us? Do they make us relaxed and happy and generous? Or do they create fear of not having enough, making us tight-fisted and self-concerned? How do we best use whatever abundance we have been given? There are no easy answers to these kinds of questions, or to questions that are frequently on my mind, maybe yours. How much is enough? How much do I really need to live a reasonably comfortable life? How much should I be giving to others? Do I take care of myself first, or do I open my fists and give generously, expecting to be enriched in non-material ways? And how do I, and the church for that matter, begin to shift from thinking in individualistic ways and understand instead through the lens of community, through God's dream for all of us? Some of us grew up with a theology that told us that success and prosperity were signs of God's favor. A contemporary version of that is the prosperity gospel that promises us all the good things we want if we only follow a particular formula. But what does that say about those who are not so fortunate? For those who work so very hard but just can't catch a break, does it mean that God does not favor them? No, that is not what our gospel teaches us. Living for the kingdom may seem daunting in these dark times when hatred and violence permeate our news, where common civility and kindness have become scarce, where thoughts and prayers are no longer adequate. There is no simple formula, but we do have the promise of God whose good pleasure is to give us the kingdom. And we do have a perfect example in Jesus' ministry.